Recently, Turd Flicking Monkey made a video criticizing anarcho-capitalism, and I'm going to be responding to some of these criticisms here. I'll also be highlighting some arguments made by other Ancaps, as well as linking to Filthy Heretics video, which I think is a pretty decent point-by-point breakdown of it. So I'm not going to be reinventing the wheel here. I'm just going to be responding to some segments of the video itself, highlighting some parts of the article that I think were completely ignored. And then I'm going to be discussing the political trichotomy as well as cone theory, and hopefully, I think, putting things into a context that will help people who are skeptical of anarcho-capitalism maybe understand it a little bit better. TFM's video is a response to critarchy, which can be understood as rule by judges, but the sense in which they're using the term rule is fundamentally very different from other systems, and we're going to get more into that later. But we'll start with some segments of his video and my response.
Anarcho-capitalism really is a utopian fantasy. It wouldn't work in reality. In fact, Ancaps know this.
Anarcho-capitalists do not maintain that having an anarcho-capitalist society would usher in a utopia. Certainly, we argue that it's the best of all of the available solutions to social problems, but what's interesting is that it's only the anarcho-capitalists who are held to a utopian standard. If you look at the costs of government and all of the problems with government, somehow none of these seems sufficient to say that government has failed, yet the moment you can imagine any sort of problem in an anarcho-capitalistic society, all of a sudden that becomes grounds for dismissing it, because for some reason anarcho-capitalism must achieve utopia in order to be justified, yet for some reason this standard is not held for people who advocate for government. For example, later on in this video, he starts talking about the American government, because he advocates for fixing the system that we have. And he argues explicitly that it didn't fail, it just became a democracy.
America didn't fail, it became a democracy. America was founded as a republic. But then, slowly but surely, the people, the left, they corrupted the institutions and made them more democratic until now we essentially have a democracy. You cannot have universal suffrage in a republic. That's really stupid. But we did, because equality, yay. Just because a republic was corrupted and became a democracy over time does not mean that the republic itself was flawed.
And the process by which he describes this happening was judges reinterpreting all of the rules through a living constitution, which he then describes as a critarchy. So the only actual example of what he's criticizing in this video is the system that he's advocating for.
This is why the living constitution was so deadly. Because we had the constitutional amendment system. If you wanted to change the Constitution, there's the amendment system. Go through it and change the Constitution. But that was too hard. Much better to just have judges reinterpret the Constitution and give the government new powers it didn't have a minute ago. That's a critarchy.
Yet somehow, this doesn't meet his standard for something having failed. The fact that minarchist government was tried and then resulted in the largest government on the planet, that's just irrelevant. We can just sweep that under the rug. Yet, because he has this paranoid conception about what'll happen in an anarcho-capitalist society, that is given so much more weight than the actual historical example of the American government failing. And he thinks that anarcho-capitalism is unrealistic and unachievable, even though the thing he's advocating for to fix the American government is to take women's rights away, which he admits is something that's probably never gonna fucking happen.
So if you talk to an ANCAP, they'll say that a government that doesn't use force or coercion, that's voluntary, isn't a government. No, that's not how words work. Where are you getting this definition? Where are you getting the definition that as long as it's a voluntary, non-coercive government, it's anarchy?
This actually is the way that words work. So every time that you use a word, each instance of the word is bound to its context, including the intended meaning of the person using the words. Words are tools. And you judge them by their utility. Now, you can criticize someone's use of words as being somehow not useful, maybe because it's unclear, but the bottom line is that anarcho-capitalists are telling you, when we say we're anti-government, this is precisely what we mean by government. Now, to use a broader definition of government that includes non-coercive government, I guess if I avoid overeating, then I've governed my hunger and therefore I advocate for government, whatever. You can expand the definition as much as you want, but this doesn't even have anything to do with the actual arguments at all. And the reason that he wants to frame things in this way is because he wants basically anarcho-capitalism to be viewed as just another political ideology to be compared with all the other ones.
So basically, Ancaps admit you're going to have a government. And so they want a voluntary, non-coercive government. That's great. But you're not an anarchist now. You basically just admitted you're going to need a government, and a government is a good thing as long as it's not coercive and it's voluntary. So now that we've established that, you're no longer anarchist.
And that's the thing that Mr. Dapperton slipped up on, that he fucked up on when he had his debate with TFM a long time ago. The issue is that anarcho-capitalism is not just another political stance. It's not just a political ideology. It's a series of moral claims that have political implications. And this is what fundamentally sets it apart. And this is why people who advocate for government have to repackage it as force. They have to repackage it as government. What's interesting here, though, is that he seems to accept that there's a distinction between coercive and non-coercive government, but the fact that he's calling them both government seems to make that distinction unimportant. Frankly, if you want to include non-coercive government as a type of government and then therefore say anarcho-capitalists aren't anarchists, fine. That's just the way you're using words. Personally, I don't think those terms are very useful. I think that the anarcho-capitalist definition of government, the libertarian definition of government, the definition fucking Obama uses,
what essentially sets a nation state apart, which is the monopoly on violence.
I think that definition works pretty well. It's pretty clear what we're talking about. He just dismissively says, oh, look it up in the dictionary. Well, the dictionary is going to give you a bunch of different definitions that don't all add up, most of which refer to governing itself and lead you in just circular fucking goose chases that don't result in anything. So, and it's so disingenuous, right? Because every single person who's red-pilled in the anti-feminist or MGTOW or manosphere, like anyone remotely non-blue-pilled is aware of feminists and their dictionary definition argument, right? Like, we've all had these conversations before, and it's so fucking bizarre that he's just going to say, oh, well, that's not in the dictionary, as if it's even relevant. This is all just semantic bullshit. But like I said, the reason he's doing it is not because it has any bearing on the actual points. It's just shifting some labels around, but it's a magic trick. It's a sophist trick designed to make anarcho-capitalism seem like it's just advocating for another government.
There needs to be checks and balances. There need to be consequences. If you put a judge in charge of a country, they are no different than a king. You can be like, well, it's not like a king because a judge is supposed to do this. Those are just titles. Once you give a judge the power of a king, you make that judge indistinguishable from a king. The reason why judges are separate in America, for example, is because they don't have legislative power. They don't have executive power. They only have judicial power. We have separation of powers. But in a critarchy, all those powers are combined in a judge, which is no different than if all those powers are combined in a king. It's no different. It doesn't matter what the person originally was. Once you give them the powers of the other branches of government, they become indistinguishable from a king or a dictator.
This is actually addressed in the article in a couple of different ways. One way I want to highlight is they say, not being above the law, the courts and police forces of a critarchy always run the risk, should they deprive others of their rights when justice does not require it, of being charged with unlawful behavior in another court. That other court might be a competitor or a group of competitors. It might also be a parliament, i.e. a representative body that acts as a public guardian of the law. Such a parliament would sit only as a court of law, however. It would not have the power to govern or to make laws that restricted anyone's rights. However, it could be an effective agent of justice, for instance, by convincing the public that the court of law or police forces it convicts are not worthy of the public's trust, or by convincing other organizations of justice to enforce its verdicts against recalcitrant convicts. Because they need the consent of all parties if they wish to avoid the risk of using violence against an innocent person, the courts of a critarchy must offer adequate guarantees of competence and impartiality. They must do so in order to elicit the cooperation of the accused and defendants, as well as to assure the plaintiffs and claimants who initiate the proceedings that their verdicts are unlikely to be contested in another court. Short of seeking a monopoly by a violent elimination of its competitors, an organization of justice has no alternative but to build up a solid reputation for justice. So in other words, it invokes everything that makes capitalism work. And another way to look at critarchy is basically as the dispute resolution organization model, where you have representatives in private courts that are represented by dispute resolution organizations that essentially function as insurance companies. And you could theoretically find all kinds of ways to criticize this, but he hasn't done this here. All he's done is he's assumed that every single power of modern governments would be invested in these people, when in reality, that's not what's happening at all. These so-called legislative and executive powers don't get imbued onto them at all. He's just assuming that all this is a reshifting of the labels based on an American standard. Now, another way that this article addresses this concern, it's kind of the bulk of the entire thing, which is the distinction between artificial law and natural law. So what they write is, leaving no room for the idea that human beings are natural persons in a natural world, current legal and political ideologies make any man or woman an artificial being, a citizen whose very essence is defined and created by the legal rules of the state to which he or she belongs. Within the state, human beings have no rights except insofar as some legal authority regulates their existence and freedom. That is why the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its Articles 6 and 15 names a legal personality and a nationality among the things people have a right to. From the point of view of the Declaration's underlying philosophy, a legal personality and a nationality, in a word, citizenship, are desirable because they are the necessary conditions of legal existence in the state. Without them, a person is a nobody. Once we substitute that perspective of legal rule for that of natural law, we must admit that what a person has a right to do or to call his own depends not on what he is or does, but on his status in the legal order in which he happens to find himself. He becomes an artificial person in an artificial order, like a piece of wood that is assigned different rights and duties depending on whether it is used in a game of chess, checkers, or backgammon. The glorification of such artificial legal orders is common in contemporary legal and political thought, where fiction seems invariably to triumph over reality. These orders are based on artificial or imaginary distinctions and on the neglect of or disregard for natural distinctions. Some of them arbitrarily or systematically refuse to acknowledge certain persons as persons at all. Others define some or all persons as being in some or all respects a part of others, to which they are therefore said to belong. Some go so far as to define human beings as parts of non-existent imaginary or fictitious persons. In fact, however, natural persons are never parts of other natural persons or legal fictions. They may become members of some association or society, and in that sense become participants in its activities, but that does not imply that they are thereby mysteriously transformed in mere parts of a person, nor does it imply that the association is a person in its own right. No matter what the philosophical pretensions behind the constructions of artificial law may be, they all share a common practical implication. They deny the freedom and equality of certain human beings. These artificial constructions cannot hide the fact that, from the perspective of law, some people either do not exist at all or exist only insofar as they are represented by others. Thus, by denying natural law and the natural distinctions that constitute it, they conjure up an idea of law that makes the non-consensual government of one person by another seem lawful. It should be sufficiently clear by now that natural law is not a question of idle speculation, but of natural fact. In this sense, a critarchy is a political system based on respect for the facts of the human world. Respect for natural law is therefore an objective category of human action. Human actions that respect law are lawful, and therefore just. Those that do not are unlawful and unjust. And so this distinction basically shuts down his entire critique, because he's using the term judges and he's completely equivocating judges under natural law with judges under artificial law, because I don't think he read the article. He's not addressing any of this at all. And he kind of briefly mentions that judges have a role in interpreting things, and that if you have a judge and they have to interpret things, there's going to be problems with their subjectivity. But the part I read earlier already addresses that. If they have competing courts and their reputation matters, well, this provides a check. This puts a check. The courts get to check each other in the same way that competitors in a market can check each other for quality. So if you think that capitalism works, this system here seems to be absolutely preferable. There doesn't seem to be any reason to believe that this isn't going to work, particularly if you think that like republicanism works or any sort of system of artificial law would work. The role of judges isn't just to interpret legal matters. The purpose of a court is to find facts. And here we have fewer constrictions on that, right? Because natural law is based on natural fact and natural objective matters of human action. So it seems like fact-finding and the determining of what's relevant or irrelevant would actually be much easier. These courts would be much better equipped to find justice than under a system of artificial law. He lays out 3 broad criticisms. Now, TFM did make a follow-up video to this, and he opens the video by reiterating his position behind calling anarcho-capitalism utopian. And to do this, he basically borrows from another video. And in that video, the guy in it is essentially arguing that capitalism and communism are really similar. And he does it in an extremely stupid and disingenuous way. But his criticisms of capitalism, free market, anarcho-capitalism, are based on environmental policies. He says there's absolutely no way that can be implemented in an anarcho-capitalist system, even though Ancaps have addressed this at length. This has been very largely debunked. You can find Learn Liberty has some great videos actually debunking all of the criticisms brought up in this segment of TFM's video. The second one had to do with minimum wage, which if you defend minimum wage, you're dumb. The minimum wage is something that people are in the future are going to talk about minimum wage the way that we talk about slavery today. It's going to be something that's seen as so morally reprehensible and so extremely backwards that, yeah, it's going to be embarrassing for anybody who has ever advocated for minimum wage. It's just absolute garbage economics. And then the third one, what was it? Oh, price gouging. That was the other one. Which, again, Learn Liberty has a great video debunking that the idea that price gouging is even a bad thing. So all those arguments are just stupid and tired. Anybody who makes those arguments hasn't even bothered to actually criticize it. So I think it's really a stupid way to try to make the argument. But then the second part of his video is he restates things about communism, that he argues that communism also doesn't want to control a market because they want to get rid of currency. The thing is, though, is his entire comparison ignores step 1 of communism, which is people violently seizing the means of production, which is essentially all property. And this is what makes communism wrong. This is what makes communism immoral. This entire approach, the entire title of TFM's second video is, judging ideologies by their outcomes. And this is, I think, entirely the wrong way to look at things, because it's not that communism results in dictatorship by accident. No, they're advocating for dictatorship. They absolutely are. It is, in theory, what they want to do. Step 1 is fucking dictatorship. There's no way for communism to work because step 1 of their system is it not working. And this is the kind of crap that statists just are completely blind to, because this is the game you're playing with other people's lives, is you're saying, let's play a game of civilization with everyone's lives and try out different systems. And what you have to realize is that, no, when it comes to human ethics, there are deontological approaches where you determine what things you're allowed to do based on moral principles. Outcome-based morality is extremely weak, and this is the weakness of the position, is that the argument is not, in my opinion, anarcho-capitalism doesn't seem like it's going to work. No. You need it not only to not work, but to be 100% impossible, and you have to know this with absolute certainty. you have to know exactly how everything is going to play out and exactly what the consequences will be. And this is from people who set up governments that fail all the fucking time. You know, clearly your ability to predict outcomes isn't that fucking good when you're advocating for systems that have already failed. So this is something that anarcho-capitalists aren't doing, is we're not saying we know exactly how everything is going to play out, because there's a little bit of honesty in that position. The point is there are things that are morally wrong, and that's really all that anarcho-capitalism necessarily entails, is recognizing that it is the morally correct position. How we get there, or how close we're able to get to it, is an entirely different discussion. But what statists do is they blur these two conversations together because they want to avoid admitting the moral argument. But here's the thing, TFM is an anarcho-capitalist. He's not a self-identified anarcho-capitalist, but if you agree with the moral stance, that's what anarcho-capitalism is. If you agree that it's the most moral ideal, then you're an anarcho-capitalist. The whole political realm is an entirely separate conversation. He goes on to offer three broad criticisms of anarcho-capitalism. The first one being that the non-aggression principle is too vague and not really applicable. I don't know. If you look into it, it is pretty well fleshed out. It's pretty clear that there's things like negative externalities, things like proportionate, retribution, etc. It seems like there actually is kind of a lot there. It's sure as shit a lot clearer and easier to use than the fucking law. Like, our official law does not compare favorably at all. Second, everybody invokes the non-aggression principle. Absolutely everybody who's not a complete psychopath invokes the non-aggression principle in their daily life. And this is, again, why people use threat narratives. This is why people package other people's actions as initiations of violence, because when they initiate violence, they want it to be perceived as a retaliation. You know, when we say he started it, you know, this is virtually all children invoke the non-aggression principle. And this is how we reason. It's so universal among humans as to be undeniable in its utility, and nothing that's ever been produced in law has ever been as useful as a non-aggression principle. And then the second one had to do with the free rider problem. Government is the ultimate free rider problem. The idea that this problem gets worse when you take away government, I think, is ridiculous. He gives an argument, a doomsday scenario regarding McNukes. Really, it seems that the effect of nuclear weapons has been that you end up not wanting to initiate violence against those people. He says, oh, what if someone's suicidal? They'll just, like, nuke everything. I don't know. I think that's paranoid as hell. But, the thing that's being ignored here is that if you're a danger to others, if you're a liability, there's repercussions for it. You know, there are repercussions set up that actually don't exist in the current system. We have capacities to do insane, hyper-violent, destructive acts under state societies, so this problem hasn't really been solved. And then he has a larger argument regarding having a military, right? It says that you have to have a strong enough military to avoid being conquered. I don't know, it seems like big, large militaries are actually more of a liability. It seems like the U.S. is actually more of a target because of its military and because of its military's practices. But again, you know, the issue with the free rider thing is that if you have a group of people that would essentially consent by tacit, right? In theory, they'd want this system. They'd prefer this system where they're forced to do it and are willing to pay for it. Then you don't need a government to force them to pay for it. People will pay for it. You know, private charity has existed in all of human history. So it seems that there's kind of this denial. It's the same as arguing for the welfare state, right? The argument is, oh, not enough people are going to give to charity, therefore we need to have welfare. Well, I see this argument as applying perfectly well to any kind of public utility. And people might think, you know what, I'm willing to pay for my entire street to have firefighting services because, I mean, shit, if my neighbor's house catches on fire, maybe it's going to spread to mine, you know? And, like, people care about their communities. They care about their direct neighbors. They care about having these services in their communities as well. One thing that happens is under an anarcho-capitalistic society, you no longer have forced association, and therefore people are allowed to locate themselves around other people that they want to be around and that they want to see prosper and that they want to have social communities with. One of the things that we're really underestimating in terms of the cost of governments is that it's not just financial. Government services actually replace and subvert social orders. Socialism is antisocial, and all forms of government are essentially socialist. So whenever government grows into an area, when you have government, that's subverting natural, voluntary social relations. And that's why I advocate for a kind of gradual transition, ideally, out of government into anarcho-capitalism through like minarchism. And this is because as you dismantle chunks of the government, then society has a chance to essentially redevelop those muscles that have completely atrophied over time from having government provide everything. This is why we live in a society where people legitimately don't believe that roads are possible without government, which is ridiculous. Private roads are as old as roads. I mean, shit. His third point, I'm not sure if he actually even labeled it a third point, but I believe the next thing he was talking about was that under anarcho-capitalism, either it's too weak and therefore gets conquered right away, which again, like if you have free trade, right? If you have like this incredibly prosperous capitalist society, where also, parents are held responsible for their actions, right? If you have a dispute resolution organization and you produce children that are then a liability, there's now a financial cost placed on parents, and finances are a greater motivation often than just like social shaming for being a bad parent. So you have incentives in place that actually promote eugenics, like natural, like non-coercive eugenics, and then you conversely no longer have a welfare state which is dysgenic in nature. So over time you have an increasingly essentially popular because they're more intelligent, more peaceful, more productive. They have capitalistic markets that can produce extreme abundance and can then trade with other companies. So any state that comes in to jeopardize that is immediately going to make enemies of every single person that's involved in trade with that person. Now, the other thing too is having a government makes you more susceptible, right? And this is why a lot of these places that get overrun, they're not anarcho-capitalist, they're small governments. They still have a tax structure in place, and that's key. Once you have that in place and all you have to do is take over the government in order to gain access to the taxes, well, there you go. That's why they're targets. If you have to not only invade and take over a country, but then continually tax them and create that structure yourself, it's just not fucking worth it. There's nothing to be gained relative to just trading with them. So the path to peacefully maintaining anarcho-capitalism isn't really as far-fetched as he's making it out to be. But of course, the other end of it that he's saying is that, well, these judges are going to eventually consolidate their power through corporations and through corruption that way. And again, this is because I don't think he read the article originally. This is already addressed in there. So, first of all, corporations are government entities, right? I mean, he may just be using it to mean large company, but corporations exist because they have special legal powers imbued in them by the government, and they use their influence in government to keep smaller, nimbler competitors out of their market. Once you don't have the ability for them to take over the government, you now have smaller competitors that can outmaneuver them, and this puts a check on monopolies. Now, you could have monopolies in anarcho-capitalism, but they'd necessarily be voluntary. You'd only have a monopoly when people are satisfied with it. Because as soon as they price gouge too much, it just creates way too big of an opportunity for anyone to step in and then, take over the market that way. But in response to this idea that like a large company, even if it's not a corporation, let's say it's just sufficiently large, that they are able to just buy off all the judges and own their own court, This doesn't make any sense, because what you're going to have are organizations dedicated to dispute resolution. If these organizations are representing corporations that everybody knows are engaging in these practices, then nobody's going to want to do business with that DRO anymore. And if a company is continually trying to do these things and do these corrupt things, no one's going to want to do business with them, because if you have a dispute with them, you know that you're not going to be able to resolve it. As a person that does business, you're going to want to be able to deal with any disputes in a rational and fair manner, because you don't want to deal with the fucking bad PR. This is why advertising is a thing. Companies care about their image, particularly when they have competitors. And this is the case even in the United States, which is not capitalistic at all. Might be one of the closest to capitalism we've seen. It's a sliver, a tiny little bit of capitalism. In a legitimate, competitive, free market, one that the world's never even seen before, you can safely assume that the pressure to be perceived as more noble and more productive and more honest and transparent than your competitors is going to be heightened to a degree we've never even seen before. And I honestly think that people are going to wonder how anybody thought otherwise once we're in the future. So I also just want to read a few of the comments that were left on the first video. I've looked at his second video here, but it seems like he doesn't really directly respond to any of these. Eudaimoniization writes, Ancaps want a state because they want businesses to provide essential services instead of the state. He says, minarchy is a utopian fantasy and doesn't account for human nature because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In a perfect world, I could get behind a small government, but here in the real world, I can't trust human beings to rule over others without grabbing more and more power for themselves, to the point where only 200 years later, the state has destroyed every foundation of a functioning society. Esoteric the Free wrote, a voluntarist society has jury nullification and decentralized courts which compete with one another. You literally can only have this if a state doesn't exist. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And Anthony A. provided a dictionary definition for anarcho-capitalism, since I guess those are the only ones that count. A state is a political organization with a centralized government that maintains a monopoly by use of force within a certain geographical territory. Anarcho-capitalism is a political philosophy and school of anarchist thought that advocates the elimination of centralized state dictum in favor of self-ownership, private properties, and free markets. Anarcho-capitalists hold that in the absence of statute, law by arbitrary autocratic decrees, or bureaucratic legislation swayed by transitory political special interest groups, society tends to contractually self-regulate and civilize through the spontaneous and organic discipline of the free market, in what its proponents describe as voluntary society. In an anarcho-capitalist society, law enforcement courts and all of the security services would be operated by privately funded competitors selected by consumers rather than centrally through confiscatory taxation. It ain't that hard. But again, the thing that I can't emphasize enough, and that's why I'm going to be concluding on this point, is that anarcho-capitalists are going above and beyond our burden of proof when we step into the political realm to engage with people on this level. Because anarcho-capitalism is not just another political system. It's not just another political thing to be compared with the others. It's a moral stance, and if you accept the moral principles, then you're in agreement with us. The question of how we create the most moral society or how we create an anarcho-capitalist society is an entirely separate one, and we need to stop blurring those conversations together. And I'm going to show exactly how this occurs by looking at these different political graphs. So TFM discusses the political trichotomy in a video, and the trichotomy is interesting. One of the things he points out is that the reason it seems preferable to the standard political compass is that it eliminates the left libertarian, because left libertarianism isn't a real political stance. And this I'm in 100% agreement with. Left libertarianism is not a thing. The left continuously switches its labels around because it has a marketing problem, because it's constantly tried and it constantly fails. But the half of it that's missing is that it's not just left libertarianism that isn't real. Right-wing authoritarianism is not real either. But before I get into that, while we're looking at the trichotomy here, the one major flaw it has is up in that upper blue corner where they label that as anarcho-capitalism. That is where minarchism belongs. Anarcho-capitalism is beyond it. And that's the key to understanding all of these different charts and graphs and compasses and things. It's a sophist trick designed to get you to think within these boundaries. Because ask yourself, what is the triangle? What is the compass? What is the spectrum? It is the compass or chart or spectrum of violent solutions to social problems. And that's all it is. When you stub your toe, or when you have any number of other minor problems in your daily life, you don't tend to use solutions on the political spectrum. Very often you use nonviolent solutions. And when you start to think of nonviolent solutions as part of the solutions that are available, you start to realize that of the solutions available, so few of them actually involve politics. So few of them actually require this. But of course, when you think of politics just within this realm of essentially violent science, well, it tricks your brain into not stepping outside of it, into thinking that you have to choose somewhere on this little chart to exist, even though there's a whole big world outside of it. So here's what you can do. Start with the 2D political compass. Once you cut off the left libertarian, you have your political trichotomy. Now, remove right-wing authoritarianism, because that's not a thing either. Once you're economically right-wing, your government doesn't have the ability to enforce all of these authoritarian policies. They need to have some sort of way of ganking you in order to justify that. So you see that economic leftism is synergistic with authoritarianism, just as libertarianism is synergistic with small government economics. As Ron Paul put it, if you deny someone of their personal liberty, you're denying their economic liberty. And if you deny someone of their economic liberty, you're taking away their personal liberty. The two are not separate in any way. If you deny one, you deny the other. And that's why my version of the political compass, the fixed version, is actually superior. But here's what you can do now. Take my fixed version of the compass and rotate it. And voila, we now have the left and right again. We now have the one-dimensional political spectrum. And this is the thing that I hate about Republicans. On the last Gay Triarchy, where we had Sayomi on, there was a bit of it where we were talking about politics, and Lordy was talking about things that Republicans advocate for, and I couldn't resist chiming in to say, like, I oppose all of these things. These things are all big government, and it's shit like regulations, fucking minimum wage, like workers' rights, just all that shit. It's all a bunch of communist fucking garbage, and I hate the fact that the Republicans masquerade as right-wing when in reality they're just to the right of all the other fucking commies. So anyway, this is how you can use the political spectrum, because if you think about it, a spectrum is a graph that has one variable. You have more of that variable, you go to one side. You have less of it, you go to the other. Well, what is the one variable in government? It's amount of force. It's amount of government coercion. Now, what cone theory does is it adds a third dimension to it that helps explain why you can have both big government authoritarianism and big government like communism on the left. And it's because cone theory places, again, not anarcho-capitalism, but minarchism as the right-wing tip. As you go to the left, because you're growing, there's multiple different directions in which you can grow. So now take the political trichotomy, take the authoritarian, like the red and the green parts, fold them together, and now we have a cone. So you see, it's all the same shit. It's all the fucking same shit, just like dressed up in different ways, and none of it's really that profound. The real freedom is to look beyond it and to realize that all of the solutions that don't involve this compass or don't involve being anywhere on here are the superior solutions, and we need to maximize those solutions and look towards those solutions. Any ideology that just assumes that such solutions are impossible is extremely narrow-minded, and it's extremely limited. 99% of the problems you encounter in your daily life, you are going to solve through non-violent, non-coercive measures. So why not expand that to the social sphere? Anyway, I think this is long enough. Hopefully I addressed everything that was relevant. I obviously didn't do everything, completely thoroughly, but I just wanted to touch on all of those points. If you guys have any questions or want me to expand on anything or think I got anything horribly, terribly wrong, let me know in the comments section. And I also want to know, I like TFM. He's one of my favorite YouTubers. And I know that he appreciates criticism. I think that some of the other criticisms were a little bit mean. And I guess at times here I got a little bit worked up. But I don't mean to cause any drama or be like, like disparaging at all. But anyway, I just think that it's just I don't understand why he has to take so many pot shots at anarcho-capitalists. If his whole stance is to take away women's rights because then we can get a more sensible government, that's kind of consistent with a path toward anarcho-capitalism also, right? And he kind of wants to get this big tent on board for, I guess, phase 1 of this plan, but it seems strange to then fixate on a hypothetical argument in a future that's post something happening that's extremely unlikely anyway. I don't know. But again, my major point is that it's wrong to advocate for government for the same reason that it's wrong to advocate for stealing from people or murdering people or violating their personhood or their property in any way. And these are rules that really we all live by, and by continuing to exist as human beings on planet Earth, through our actions, we can be judged as hypocrites if we advocate for things that recognize these rights for ourselves but not for others. And on this basis, what we can do is we can prioritize non-violent, non-coercive solutions over coercive ones. Now, the first thing we have to do is just have some widespread consensus on the moral superiority of anarcho-capitalism. And how we transition into that sort of a society, well, that's an entirely separate conversation. And there's all kinds of different people advocating for different things. But again, those conversations are separate. And the reason that all governments that I consider to be a failure is not because of their results. It's because, in theory, at step 1, they advocate for taking my rights away. And I don't think that anybody can advocate for that without being a hypocrite. Anyway, thank you for listening. Have a good day.